Johan's last lecture. So, Johan, please.
So, thank you. So yeah, last lecture. As I promised, a bit of an easy lecture. It will not be very long. I think I will take about an hour. It also have the highest concentration of just pictures, photographs, and so on. So it contains science. There's a scientific part at the beginning. And the latter part, I will tell you a little bit about how I sort of try to do something useful. So, okay. I come back with my the picture which I always show. Is of course this what you see here, beautifully patterned ecosystem with has all sorts of patterns, all sorts of scales and so on. And that's something that I find very interesting to study, and that will be the topic of this lecture. But I want to start with a question. Who knows here how nature works? No? No? Good. I've got a book for you. A book you. Sorry? Nature. No. Yeah, that would be nice. I will tell you how nature works. No, the natural world works. Nature works. So, yeah. Well, I've got a book for you. How nature works. It's well, exactly. It's an ecologist that tells you about a physics book. What more do you want here? So, how nature works. This was a book which came out, and although it's actually a very nice book to read, it's a huge overstatement. But on the other hand, but he came up with a paradigm, an idea of how processes, universal processes, would occur in ecosystems, and he came with the paradigm of scale-free characteristics, patchiness in ecosystems. And his typical thing is that if you would make a sand pile, beginning that would just build up, but as it builds up further, then you would have little avalanches, and then as it goes even further, then you get avalanches of all sorts of sizes coming down and finding themselves a sort of a balance. And so that was sort of the seek point of your sand pile. And if you would look at the avalanches and how big they are, and you would put them. I've always been wondering how he then measured the avalanches. But anyway, I wouldn't be surprised. And so he came up with what's this? Can I? Oh yeah. Okay. If you would plot the size of the avalanche versus the frequency, then you will see there's many small avalanches, and there is much less big avalanches, and very few very big avalanches. And as you put it on a log scale, then you can put a straight line through it, and that you call that, of course, a power law. Rather than you could say like a power relation, it would be a neutral term. No, it's a law of physics. And so this has been picked up by ecologists and actually be used. For instance, if you would have a forest and there would be a gap in the forest, and if you have then the trees that will sort of be vulnerable because they are very tall, thin trees, the trees next to the gap would also have a tendency of falling or be more vulnerable. So you get a sort of a forest that just keeps on, the edges just keep on falling. And you get then a patterns that you see there, large-scale patterns found in here. And well, this is characteristic of what they call the phase transition. You would actually go to a critical state, which is actually there by the mean tree density, which again has this power law. And so this would also apply to ecosystems. And maybe actually I think that forest fires are an example where it actually works about like that. You have these forest fires, they destroy a whole patch, but it stops at some point. That new patch there, where new trees start to grow, is actually less vulnerable to fire, and you get a whole patchwork of patches with trees, somewhat more vulnerable, others less vulnerable. So it's a tiny little bit different than my previous explanation, but it's the same idea. Of course, yeah. Does it also work for other ecosystems? Well, they all apply it to all sorts of ecosystems. Things where you look at and you think like, I'm not seeing that. But of course, and then you have a line and it was a bit curved, but still it put a straight line through it. And so I've always been like a bit in doubt about, okay, do we really see this? And what sort of processes are there? Also, if you look at nature, you have the feeling like there are small patches, and then there's a new scale of patches, and there's another scale of patches, not necessarily scale-free. I mean, there might be examples, but there's also other possibilities. And I want to talk today about ecosystems with patterns at different scale, but particularly nested patterns. And of course, I've got a few nice examples. I will not talk about Shark Bay, but you can see the stripes within stripes. So 2 scales of patterning occurring. A Great Barrier Reef is of course fantastic. It's just a nice picture, but again, you see sort of the large scale bands going across and the small scale patterns in the deeper parts that are more blue. I would love to talk about these ones and show you my data on corals. Unfortunately, I never managed to, I also never really tried, but it must be the perfect holiday, isn't it, to go there and do some research. But I will talk about salt marshes and mussel beds and the patterns that you can see in there. Okay, so today's lecture first will be about these multi-scale patterns in mussel beds. Let me get my... multi-scale patterns in mussel beds, then creek formation in salt marshes, also this complex thing, the photograph that I showed at the beginning. And then I will talk about something completely different. Actually has not that much to do with science. It builds on science, but it hasn't got a scientific goal. And it's, well, it's something that I do these days in the light of the demands of society, so to say. Okay, mussel beds. As I've shown you, of course, these pictures already. So you have this large-scale landscape within that with the bands, as you can see here. Look a little bit further, and you see these small-scale patterns developing. And of course, that's a complex thing because if you would have a look at the photos here more closely, you see that here there's actually more patterns there on the top side here. So there's a gradient of patchiness going about over this patch. So it's a complex, heterogeneous landscape of patterns that are developing and not developing and so on. And so we wanted to also investigate that, and the same person, Chuanxing Liu, that did this stuff on the phase separation, thought also that it would be an interesting thing to do. Actually, he made that first phase separation model because he wanted to make a model where you could nest one type of patterning in a PDE within another scale of patterning using a single PDE system. Never worked. So what we did at the end was just, okay, we have this model and we have that model, we just link them. And then we basically make a system. You can see here where we have, should actually be another picture here because we basically in the background we have just the PDE model running. It basically, it has growth and mortality and it predicts a certain density. And that prediction of density is then transferred onto the IBM model that you see here. Much larger scale and so on. Many, many more mussels than you've seen so far. And that then determines how many mussels can survive, that imposes a mortality on the mussels. And then, of course, it also works the way back, that the conditions that you create in the IBM are fed back into the other model. So it's an interactive interactive model, but weakly. And that's actually a characteristic of many models where they have patterns at multiple multiple scales, is that there are really 2 models, but they weakly link them. Except for the salt marsh one, but that's for later. So what you're looking at here is a larger field with mussels, and there's a little section that we zoom in, and we made now if you try this at least in 2014 on a normal computer, you have to run it for days and days and days, if not weeks. And so we actually made a model that ran on a graphics processor, and a very fancy gaming card basically. And that you have to. There's in the end, maybe it's better if I just run the model. So you see here the process is developing. So basically you have seen both things, but now it's one model, 1 or 2 linked models, developing patterns and making the large-scale banded patterns. But within that, you can also see that there's a small-scale patterns. And we wanted to do that. I should have told it before, of course. I always tell people first think about the question and then make the model. I'll do it wrong myself. So the idea was, let's see what happens if you switch off these various types of patterns. And can you then see how it affects the properties of the emergent properties of the ecosystem, that these skills really matter. So this is a model with 2 million muscles. So if you want to then compute like you do in the simple simulation that you have on, that you saw on the Dropbox, then you have to compute 4 trillion distances between muscles. It just became a bit problematic. So basically we separated the whole, we blocked the whole field. And then we said, like, well, we make small blocks, and any muscle only interacts with the muscle in its own block and with the muscles in the surrounding blocks, and anything further it doesn't interact with. And the size of the blocks was just simply determined by the influence ranges. And so we got it running, and then we looked at how this model worked. And so we made this bifurcation plot, this time completely numerical, no fancy auto or that doesn't work, but you can still make it. So along the x-axis here, I'll not forget to explain the graph this time, you have the algal concentration in the overlying water, so the amount of food available to the muscles, and you see the density of the muscles along the y-axis. It's on a log scale this time, so that you can better see. And you see the basically, this is the homogeneous equilibrium, so that this means no muscles can survive. In here you have the patterned equilibrium, and what is striking, of course, is that they partly overlap. So basically you have a system with 2 stable states. You start at very high algal densities with only a single state. The muscles can also always develop. If you have a lower algal concentration, you have 2 stable states, and at very low algal concentration there's no state left. What is, of course, is very clear in this picture is that if you have just a homogeneous model without any pattern formation, there's a very short tipping point involved. Or actually, not very short because it goes all the way to here, but it's more on that side. If you then add this small scale pattern and large scale pattern, you see that slowly you go further and further and further into that part of the plot. So the muscles can survive at lower and lower density of food. So increasing the possibility of the muscles to survive in this landscape by these various steps of complexity within the ecosystem. What also is striking is that the range that you have here along the range for which 2 stable states occur changes. And this is a bit unclear here, but if you just make that you just plot them as a value, then you see it here. The bistable domain is biggest in case of only the homogeneous state, and then becomes successively smaller if you have if you add more complexity to the system. So of course here the difference is quite small, but the one that has 2 stable states, so you have 2 scales of patterning, has the biggest, the smallest bistable domain. We also did this game of perturbing. Oh, sorry, SS is small scale pattern, LS is large scale pattern, thanks for reminding it, and nested pattern means both. Should have explained that. Good point. And so we also get the same game as last time. We perturb the model and see how quickly they recover. And then you see that the one with the nested pattern is far quicker in recovery than the one without any patterns. And so every scale reduces the mortality a little bit and makes it the muscles are quicker in recovering. And also the density at collapse changes. And what that means is if you have a system without any patterns, then the tipping point occurs at a quite high number of muscles. So you lose, suddenly your whole muscle bed is gone. If you add the different scales of patterning, then the muscles can persist for longer, so at a lower algal density, but the patchiness also becomes much smaller. So basically you can go further, the biomass goes closer to 0, and then there's the collapse. With the nested patterns, that basically means they're already almost entirely gone before you have something of a collapse. And so the muscle bed really persists for very long. That's what that means. Everybody understand this? I hope. Great. And so, yeah, of course, I'm in the ecological community, and then, of course they see like, here's this guy again with his experiment, with his models, and he thinks he understands the whole world by playing with the computer. And so at some point we got a project together with the Dutch Nature Conservancy, and they wanted to restore mussel beds. And they were saying, well, it's interesting to see how it, whether we should take care of that. And so we made different mussels, different beds with different degrees of patchiness. And yeah, of course, you cannot make a dramatically big mussel bed. That's rather hard. So we basically just made small beds. We didn't expect them to survive much long, any of them, but we just wanted to see whether that would differ, whether a homogeneous bed would really be washed away faster than one with patchiness. And so it's basically a recovery experiment. And so this is what we did. We put them in clumps, and we were first thinking like, well, how do we mimic a Turing pattern or a nested pattern? And we thought like, well, let's not do that. It takes an enormous amount of time, and then before you know it, you're not distributing them homogeneously over this larger band, so to say. So we made them sort of, we made it a sort of net, and this basically means that you have two scales of patterning. You have the band itself, and you have an open piece, so to say. So that basically means that you concentrate the muscles in here. Of course, here you have a large-scale pattern, but no small-scale pattern. Here you have no pattern, and here you have the small-scale pattern, but not the large-scale pattern. And so, well, this is what we tried. It's actually the work of Helena de Paoli, one of my PhD students, and you can see the projects that were involved in that. And this is the results. So actually, it turned out in this experiment that the small-scale patterning was really the most important. So the behavioral patterning was very important for survival. The large-scale patterning had less of an effect. And we think actually because, well, it was a very small thing, so you didn't really get any depletion there. So the functioning of a large-scale pattern was not properly mimicked. And so, but clearly there was an effect of the aggregation, so to say, on the pattern formation. And we repeated it 2 times, one time in June and one time in October. Okay, so yeah, so far so good. Any questions about this part?
So what's the minimal ingredient of your model that gives the nested patterns?
Sorry?
What's the minimal ingredient of your model to give the nested patterns?
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what you mean with ingredients, but we had just the model the 2 models that were used. That's what you have on your computer in the Dropbox. So one is this PDE model, the Turing type model that creates these bands, and you have the individual-based model that creates these clusters. And you basically link them to each other so that the one model determines the biomass of the other model, and the other model determines then the survival chance of the other one. And so you have the mortality, the biomass goes to the individual-based model that gives you a certain degree of clustering that determines then the mortality in the other model. That's how it, if I remember right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I would actually should have put my picture of the very first this salt marsh picture again. You might remember this is salt marsh with this big gully there with all the stripes in it, and so a hugely complex system. You might think like, oh, lots of things are happening there, and that, of course that is the case. I mean, there's just like meandering of the creeks, and that's a very complex process. But on the other hand, we were still having the question. Can't we, is there a sort of a simple building block that you can use to, let's say, can we explain 66% of the salt marsh using a very simple model that's just a single principle of basically how vegetation interacts with water flow and how water flow interacts with vegetation. And what we meant with that, you can basically see here. If you go to a tidal flat and a patch of grass would start growing here, this is Spartina, well, a specific salt-tolerant grass, very spiny, then what you see very quickly a little mountain starts to develop because the plants, they lower the flow speed that captures sediment, that builds up a little bit. But yeah, there's also energy conservation, and the water wants to go through it, but yeah, can't anymore, so it goes around it. And so what you see is that there's a sort of a shapes in a depression developing around it, for which it actually is likely more difficult for the vegetation to grow in. So you see already a sort of a scale-dependent effect, a local facilitative effect of the plants, but a somewhat larger scale negative effect of the plants. And so, well, of course, again, I'm an ecologist, so we need to go with some data, and it didn't seem too difficult to test this. So, does this come from? I think I've messed up my slides again. Anyway, we can go on. So, and so we planted plants in different positions. We planted them in the vegetation, in here. We planted them in the water, here. And as a sort of a null situation, we planted them here. And we looked at how they grew. And what you can see that is that they grew very well if you put them in the vegetation. We did two situations. We thought, like, well, if you put a plant here, it has lots of competition. Well, here they don't have competition. And we want to sort of know what the effect of competition is. So we made a sort of plastic sheet which removed the competition at least above ground, not below ground. Below ground was a bit more difficult. And so, and then you can really see that light competition depresses the growth a little bit, but they're still both are quite high. And then you have in the water here, they didn't want to grow very well, as you can see here. It's much lower. And the ambient location here is a bit in between. So this sort of confirms the idea that we have of a scale-dependent effect. So basically, the question was, can we now explain the patterning of gullies and side gullies and so on in this model? With this principle, with this idea of skill-dependent feedback. And this was picked up by one of my PhD students, Roland van der Wijs. I have a photograph of him later. And for that, we basically built how do you call it? A caterpillar model, wasn't it? With shallow water equations and so on. So quite with a physical description of how the water would move around the vegetation. Maybe it's good to just explain a little bit. This is how I basically explain shallow water equations to ecology students. Imagine you have a little ramp, and then you have a flat surface, and then you have a piece with vegetation. If you would have a little bucket of water and you would release it here, then of course it goes down slope because there's gravity would put it down. And that part is taken care of by the part G times the dx, where nu is the height of the water plus the height of the sediment underneath it, up here. So that basically pulls the water down. Then if the water comes here, of course, there's no elevation change anymore. So if you wouldn't explicitly model this, the water would just stop. And that's of course a bit strange. And so what you have to do is basically the momentum of the water needs to be carried over, carried further. And that's the second part of the model. This part is the carryover effect in U dimension. This is the carryover effect in Y dimension, sorry, X and Y dimensions. And then it enters the vegetation here in here. And then friction becomes really important. Of course, everywhere is a bit of friction, but the friction becomes really dominant in the vegetation, and that's the B term here. And the B term can actually be quite elaborate and complex, and dependent on vegetation, and dependent on flow rates. This is a much too simplified effect. And that basically, I didn't explain you, of course, is the flow rate of the water. And so basically you're computing how the water would flow through the landscape. Of course, you also have to then keep up how much water is everywhere. And to do that, you basically use the mass conservation law, and basically any water that moves is subtracted from one point and added to the other point. So that's mass conservation. Does everybody get this? I think I'm probably boring you as a physicist. You already know this, I guess. Maybe, yes? Just general labels for friction in this term. You could make them constant, but it would be a bit strange for this context here, but should be a function maybe.
Yes, so there's not viscosity.
No, viscosity is basically entered in this model with a diffusion term. Viscosity makes that if the water flows here and the water is a bit viscous, that the water here slows down and the water next to it is pulled along. So the flow rate diffuses out, so to say. And that's also included in the model. This is a simplified explanation for ecology students. But
so the U by dt is just like a damping of momentum being sort of sucked out of the system by the vegetation.
That's B, of course.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, the diffusion is conserved. Yeah, conserves the momentum.
No, it doesn't.
Well, the real diffusion does not, but in the model it does.
Oh.
It moves from the point A to point B, the U, the flow velocity. Of course, you have turbulence. Turbulence absorbs the momentum. Yeah, sure.
Okay, you answer my question. Thank you.
Anyway, should I be explaining you how the physical processes like this work? I don't think that's the idea. Anyway, this is the model that we used. We also included a quite detailed description. Actually, we tried a couple of them. How the vegetation would affect the flow rate, and you have to then take care of it as soon as the vegetation goes. The water goes over the vegetation, that the vegetation imposes friction, but the water just happily goes over it, so that you have to sort of combine these 2 points. And that was done using the Baptiste equation. I didn't include that in the graph. I didn't want to make it too complicated and would only scare ecologists. So if you would make a model, just to give a basic idea of how this model would work, if you would just have a pool with water in there and the vegetation would be a little square dot in the middle, then basically this is what you, this is how this looks. So you get that the vegetation imposes friction, leads to a reduction of the flow rate up here. So what you see is the color is the flow rate, and there's lower flow rate here, and also it is higher flow rate around it, as you can see here. Well, particularly on the sides, not so much in the front. Okay, so this is a very small model. Can we use this to explain how a salt marsh develops? So, like the complexity that you see here, all the things in there. So I didn't really include the whole model. It's quite a complex model with sedimentation and erosion and vegetation growth and all these terms. Vegetation growth, of course, dependent on the elevation. So if it gets higher, the plants grow better. It creates a positive feedback. It's all included. And this is how it then looks like. Of course, I immediately go to the simulations. That's what us ecologists do. And so you look at this square area of salt marsh at the moment, and very blue, so underwater. And we plot the sediment elevation in here. There's water flow, and there's bed shear stress. It's about 100 meters, actually. And that, so if you run the model, it does this. So you see that this creek formation is, with this very simple model, and just friction imposed by vegetation, the water going around it, you start with a situation where you have these patches of plants. Basically, the water goes in between these patches. These patches expand and then leave basically behind the gullies. And so this is basically how it then looks like. Yeah, if you then compare that with the real world, then yeah, looks pretty okay, I would say. So this is the model that we thought like, okay, we have a model at, and what is actually a striking thing in this model is that it creates a main gully. There are side creeks going perpendicular from these gullies. It's really bad to see. That's because the resolution of the beamer. But what you see is that there's creeks, there is side creeks, and there's again side creeks. And along the main creek, the distribution of side creeks, well, you have to just believe me, is pretty regular. So again, there's a suggestion of regularity. If you then look at the perpendicular, like this side creek here, it creates side creeks, and these side creeks are rather regular distributed along the main creek. So there seems to be a sort of regularity reoccurring at different scales. And if I remember so yeah, this is another example. There is actually, that's in the model. In the real world, this process repeats itself 5 times. And you see again that there's always like a sort of a, it's never completely irregular, but here's a side creek, and there's a side creek, and there's a side creek, and there's a side creek. And you go here along, you find the side creek there, you find a side creek there, and so on. So this is not very visible anymore, but in the real salt marsh, this salt marsh, there are 5 orders of side creeks forming. Well, as I said, it's a scaling process. Okay, there was actually also some emergent effect that we found very interesting. What you see is that you get this boundary, this front of erosion eating itself into the marsh. At first we thought like this is a bit strange, we set an artifact or so. But later on we actually observed that this actually occurs in salt marshes. This sort of erosion front in areas where these creeks are eating. This is actually near Sapelo Island in Georgia, in the United States, where there's not so much tidal difference, and people say that the increase of the water level makes that more drainage is required, if you can express it like that. And this leads to the erosion of the marsh in the form of these erosive fronts. And this all results from a simple principle where you have... Oh, sorry.
Johan, I have a question concerning the role of the front and the roughness of the front. Like when you, in the simulation, there was this front propagating forward, and then behind, then there are these different lines and sublines forming. So if you were to make the front flat,
yeah, I don't know that, how you would do that. We don't make but you have these gullies forming. So you have already a sort of these gullies sort of attract the water. Yeah. So what basically happens is the salt marsh goes up very quickly, and the creek formation doesn't catch up with that. Yeah. And so at that some moment you get that sort of a front develops here, which then moves inwards and forms the phenomena that you see here. If you lower the sedimentation rate, you don't get that, because the plateau doesn't go high enough, quick enough. And then you don't get this front developing.
So the roughness of the front is quite important.
Yeah, I just observed it. I found examples of where it looked like also to occur in nature. I never studied it much. It doesn't occur in the salt marsh where I'm working, and Georgia is not next door. So, although it would be great to go back to Sapelo. Okay. So, well, just to give a basic explanation, so what happens now? Now we have a sloping landscape. Let's say that's almost flat, and the back end is a bit higher than the front. So what you get is the water flows down, but any location where the water concentrates, that deepens also. It creates more erosion. It creates a little deepening. That focuses the water in there, and that creates, in the end, the gullies. But then you have a second-order slope developing. So what happens on the second-order slope is, again, this runs down. Your water starts to run down this slope. So you have the same process repeating on the second-order slope. That creates a third-order slope. And so this is a repeating process that you find developing in this landscape, all because of one simple effect of, well, basically during configuration of a local activation of the vegetation and large-scale inhibition because of the water flow. So we thought that was pretty cool. We started also to study, that's what Roland in the end did, what is happening here. And Roland was particularly interested in the effect of the vegetation and particularly on the solidity of the soil. So basically what happens with the most important effect that vegetation has on a salt marsh is that it actually draws the water out of the soil and thereby compacts the soil quite much. So when you have vegetation growing on a salt marsh, it has much compacted soil. Well, this leads to that if the water goes over it, and you would put a little column of that soil on the salt marsh, you will just see that it stays there and it takes a few days to dissipate. If you go on a tidal flat and you make the same core, the first water will just flatten it. It will immediately disperse outwards. So there's an enormous effect of the vegetation on the degree to which this sediment would diffuse. And this we put in the model. So we basically made the diffusion of the sediment a function of the presence of vegetation. And then you see the following happening, that along this, this is maybe not a very good graph, I should have taken another one. Well, I'm not sure what's on the x-axis. Come on. Ah. Okay. So in this graph, you see along the x-axis a change in the effect that the plants have on diffusivity. Not the diffusivity itself, but how the plants affect that. And then you see that if the plants have no effect on diffusion, you hardly get any pattern formation. It stays just a very roughly sloping effect. So the effect of the plants there is hardly present. If you go to the other side, you see that more and more orders of creeks development start to develop in this ecosystem, and you see also that the drainage flow, for instance, becomes more and more efficient. So you see the pattern is developing, but you see also how it affects the functioning of this landscape. And of course, sedimentation is also positively affected by that. And that's of course very important because that allows the system to compensate for sea level rise. I should have taken another graph. Any questions so far? Okay. So to continue. Not sure what's happening with my laptop. Okay, so that's actually quite interesting because if you now look at the geological record and there was a certain moment in time where these plants started to emerge in millions and millions and millions of years ago. Before that, you see that, for instance, rivers were much more characterized by braided channeling. So this is not a study by us, a study that occurred far before we ever did our research. And so as the higher plants evolved, also you see slowly a change into more meandering channels. So even on the scale of the whole planet, this process of the vegetation fixing the sediment basically shaped our planet. Yes?
But how do we know? I mean, how is that?
They found that back in the geological, they can see the creek still, to some extent, in the great geological record.
Okay.
It's some years that I read this, so.
So that seems amazing to me.
It's Nature Geosciences, so I presumed that it's the case. But definitely what you have is that, so if you go really long ago, like this is basically how the landscape looked like before there were higher plants. Much more braided systems and hummocked with biofilms most likely. I mean, there weren't any higher plants, so bacteria and these sort of things were the most important ecosystems. Then after the evolution of the higher plants, you basically get these sorts of landscapes. So that's why we think that this process of vegetation is a simple Turing configuration of a local activation by the plants and a somewhat larger scale inhibition was very important for basically how our planet looked like. Okay, summarizing. So self-organization has a profound influence on the development of at least intertidal ecosystems since the Precambrian. We have actually studied these intertidal ecosystems and looked at the layering, and you can then look at the geological records, and you find the same layering back in the sedimentary records of the very early Earth. And the simple scale-dependent feedbacks, and so the emergence of roots had a rather profound influence on well, at least intertidal systems, but I would actually say the whole planet. Okay, the terrestrial part of the planet. Any questions so far? Yes?
So in that case, the soil is homogeneous. The stiffness of the soil is homogeneous, right?
We start our simulations with a homogeneous landscape. In the real world, nothing is ever homogeneous, of course.
Yeah, I was thinking if it's in your model, it's easy to introduce, for example, like very rocky regions within the soft soil and stuff like that, and if you have any prediction how that can change the patterns.
Yeah, yeah, that creates little inactive areas. We sort of tried that, but we did it in a Dutch way. We made dikes. They're basically rocky shores. So and in many places now we are sort of de-embanking salt areas to allow salt marshes to develop, but the salt marshes are protecting the dike, so we want to have some salt marsh in front of the dike. And then, of course, you have to make all sorts of shapes because you have to use the configuration that's available, and that's basically how and so it changes the shapes, but not fundamentally. No. Does it answer your question? Yeah, okay. Okay, let's have a see what mine. Oh yeah, so an extension of the Turing principle, and that's actually what we thought, but it sort of cascades through the scales, and that is something that we find very interesting. It's driven by water deflection, so rather than a skill-dependent feedback, we said this is a stress divergence principle. I'm very good at relabeling general concepts and give them an ecological name. That's okay, so now something else. I mean, all this fuzzy stuff over early planet Earth and plants being in there and so on. I mean, what use is that? Zero, isn't it? And so, yeah, scientists are in the ivory tower. And of course, normally we ask each other how good a scientist we are. And then we find ourselves very good scientists. And that, of course, led to criticism, because scientists seem distant. That's what people say. I must say, I've never asked a typical scientist during a party about what he works on, and you regret it within 5 minutes. But that's what people say in the news. And so needed is more useful science. And so something that helps other people, that helps managers, how we deal with ecosystems, that the fishermen are capturing more mussels. And of course, we also need to communicate it better. And that is something that, well, you can see at my institute is strikingly influenced in the way that our institute works. You can see that some people are doing applied research and they are loads of money. And then there are people like me focusing on more fundamental questions. And of course, we are sort of beggars. And so, yeah, that was for me a bit of a problem, because particularly in the Netherlands, they would, if you would apply for money at the Dutch NSF, they would ask, like, what's your co-founder? Which company is supporting you? We want that you have 5%. It's not much. 5% of your money has to come from either a company or from maybe a governmental institution. And that was for me a bit difficult, because my models are not really predicting. They don't really provide you with useful. Actually, I didn't want to work with a mussel fisherman either. I mean, they want to fish more and earn more money, and how irrelevant, I would think. That's not what the government thinks, but I think that. So I've had so yeah, this is my picture for the business world, of course. I didn't like it much, so I thought I need to do something else. And what's also striking is that in the Netherlands, of course, we need to adapt to climate change. I live below sea level. And so the dikes the water is going up, and the dikes, you cannot always increase dike height. The water will at some point just go through. But actually, dikes are quite permeable. If you wouldn't constantly pump the water out, it would just slowly fill up like a bathtub. So you need to do something. You need to do something with it. And then you say, well, what do you do? We make a sort of a modern dike. We do a first dike and an opening and then a second dike, and we let the stuff in between silt up, so that you have let's say a very broad dike, and you don't have to pay a lot of money for that. It's much cheaper. Well, the locals didn't much like it. They thought that giving up agricultural fields to make it nature, basically, it was the biggest sin you could do. And so there's lots of resistance in the area against doing generally something for nature. And actually they think all this fuzzy-wuzzy idea for building with nature and putting something in front of the dike, a natural ecosystem, to protect the dikes rather than just make the dike higher, was not taken very seriously. So from a more general viewpoint, I wanted to communicate to people that actually nature had all sorts of values, that you could use it for all sorts of things. And, went too fast. So this is actually a very nice thing that basically shows, of course it's Dutch, so you can't read it, basically shows the problem. He said, if there's an organization called Nature and Environment that says like, well, if you want to do something sporty, go walk in nature. And then I think like, walk in nature? You're walking to the agricultural fields. It's just nettles there and grass and just harvested grain, I think. So what do you mean nature? People have no idea what nature is. They think that this is nature. This is a Dutch agricultural field. We have a new practice these days. We mow, rather than bringing the cows to the grass, we bring the grass to the cows. And then we make sure that nothing else grows there. I mean, do you see like a dandelion? One dandelion, you know, yellow flower? No, nothing. It's complete monoculture. Oh, if you would go to this area and the local people think that this is how it should be. This has always, of course, there were more flowers in the old days, but this has always been an agricultural field for their perspective. Well, that's not really true. If you go for this area, this very area, you go 2,000 years back, this is how it looked like. A peatland. That was a peat. That's the reason why it's all sinking away now, because the peat is degrading. And so you can see this highly organized landscape, this patchy landscape. And that's 2,000 years back. If you go 1,000 years, well, 1,000 years back rather than 2,000 years back, then this is how it looks like. At that moment, the peatlands were all drowned, and salt marsh has developed. This is, of course, the same ecosystem, but just from a different perspective. We only have one salt marsh this big. But you can see how structured and patterned this ecosystem is. So these natural ecosystems are highly patterned. The ones that are not patterned, this one, is human-made. Humans are great destroyers of patterning. They want to make everything homogeneous, and then they sit behind a computer and start modeling a pattern. Doesn't sound very logical, isn't it? And so, yeah, I thought, like, let's do something about that. And I want to explain to people how it looked like in the past, how beautiful it was, of course, on the one hand, but also what use that was and how it's helped people. And so I got a partner in crime for the UNESCO geopark, the Schelde Delta. A geopark is like a national park, but without the protection. It's only communication about the value of the natural ecosystem, much from the geological viewpoint. And this is of a certain area in the neighborhood of where I live, where you can see again the natural processes shaping the landscape. And it very much involves nature. If you look at the typical geopark is like a volcano. And we are a very unique geopark in the south because it's a very recent, volcanoes can be hundreds of thousands, if not millions years old. This thing is not older than 500 years. So it's very recent. So nature actually actively helps shaping this landscape, but also humans help shaping this landscape. And so, so I teamed up with them, and they saw what we were modeling, and we were modeling the landscape. And that's actually something that we could help. And actually say, well, you know, I can actually do, or we can actually do a bit more than just modeling. We can also use these models and just make it a landscape, put plants on it, and make it look like the landscape that we previously had. And so, together with a visualizer, this is done by a person called Alko Glimmerveen. We looked at how the landscape in the area changed through the past 12,000 years. So this is just after the ice caps have disappeared from the area, and you see that. So it's very cold, the polar desert, and braiding rivers find their way to the sea. And the sea is actually quite far away because the Doggersbank is but anyway, the sea is nearly near Norway. Sorry. And so you can also see here braided rivers, and they have geological evidence for it. I must admit, they just say that, and I have no idea how they check that. But anyway, and so that's 12,000 years ago. And then 9,000 years ago, the sea actually slowly came closer by. It became hotter, and the sand that had been deposited by both the ice caps, but also by the river that you see flowing there, started to form parabolic dunes. And you get a landscape that's formed by these sort of dunes that are eating into the landscape, and then the vegetation following it up, chasing it back, so to say, regrowing in these parts, and then so we actually can still find these parabolas back in the area where this occurred. And then after a little while it became a salt marsh. And so that's because at that moment, at 9,000 years back, the sea level raised with a speed of about 1 meter per century. And that basically drowned everything. So it became an intertidal system with salt marshes, as you can see here. And then at 2,000 years back, actually the dunes on the coast closed, and you got this peatland landscape. And then the patterns were completely different. You have these. I will show you some more of the peatland patterns. Peatlands with a river being enclosed by the peat and going as a small little river towards the sea. And so you see a whole series of landscapes occurring there, and basically with all having their characteristic patterns and so on. So that, of course, found it very interesting. And we have a PhD student now looking specifically at the peatland phase. She's basically trying to see how these landscapes have functioned, what was the driving magnet. We see all sorts of remnants of these landscapes in Zeeland, but we don't really know how that works. And so that's what she is studying. So you have at 3,000 years before Christ, you have basically an intertidal system. Then you see the yellow lines, the closing of the sand barriers, and the whole thing became a peatland and disappeared again at around 300 AD when the Romans left. And we think that the management of the system, the Romans interfered a lot, but kept it in good shape. As soon as they left, the whole landscape was lost. Although we actually don't know precisely how it works. But this series, we went along with the geologist and sampled all these different landscapes and see what you can find back. Sometimes you find very clay material, that means it's a salt marsh, or you find sandy material, then you're on tidal flat, and all these sorts of things. And there's people that know that perfectly. And so if you want to see now how it has looked like then, it's very difficult. In Europe, all these peatlands have been dug out, removed, and so on. If you want to see how that landscape looked like in the past, you have to go to Russia, which of course nowadays is rather difficult. I wouldn't dare to. This is near Arkhangelsk, so that's the White Sea in the north of Russia. And there you see the peatlands, as you can see here. This is a peat bog in between our rivers, crisscrossing. This is a tidal river. The water goes in and out, and these are rather bigger tidal basins, and these are salt marshes, if I'm correct. I can't really see, but at least further north there are salt marshes. But here you see these large patterned peatlands. Here you can see the patterns a little bit. A very clear picture. And so it's a sort of system which combines the stripes of the peatland and the creeks of basically, which looks like similar as a salt marsh. And if you look at the stripes here, they're all, you can't really see very well here, but the stripes are perpendicular to the direction which the water goes down in the landscape. This is a bog. A bog is higher, is raised. The water would hence drain from the top of the bog to the stream here. And you can see that the nature is building dikes here. Building dikes to prevent the water from flowing down. And that's why you see actually that the darker, blacker patches here are just pools with water. So that's rather remarkable, because on the one hand you have a sort of a creek system in a salt marsh phase, and it wants to remove the water. Well, it allows it in and it allows it out. On the other hand, you also have the peatland, which does exactly the opposite. It builds naturally out of itself dikes and wants to keep the water in. And that's because it's fresh water. There's a raised bog, and it needs the fresh water as to grow. And that's actually what we are studying. And so, so much about. I had a series of photographs of how it looks like close by. This is Kimeri National Park in Latvia. One of the few. This is not really a coastal one. It's 20 kilometers from the coast. And I've not been there myself, but there was a person who was very happy to, for a small fee, to go and take photographs, and you can see how it looks like. So He also likes to change the colors. This is much more colorful than in the real pictures. But yeah, you can see here the little hummocks. So these are hummocks of peat in a matrix of well, underneath here is also peat, but it's just, it has rained a little bit, so the standing water is in the pools. And you see trees, there's all sorts of trees, and pine trees and birch trees. And also look at the purple stuff. It's very important. You guys know heathlands, I guess. You guys all have been to a heathland. A heathland is a very human-constructed landscape. It doesn't exist in nature. The heathland plants that you find in the heathland actually originate from the peats. That's the natural habitat, because they're very nutrient-poor, just as these heathlands. And so this I do not know the name in English, but you find them naturally here in these peatlands, coloring them purple. Okay, this is also good. This is for scale. This is a photograph which I stole from internet, so I took it out of the PDF. But you see that the trees are hardly bigger than humans. They're small. And so this really is very stunted growth, because a bog hardly contains any nutrients. And so Argontola is now studying basically also how this looks like if you go to look at the whole peat ecosystem, and then really at a big scale. So if you look at a scale of 100 kilometers, what you actually see is it's not so very clear in this but you see here the streams inside the bogs. So what the red stuff here is the peat. The green stuff are trees, but within that there are streams draining the water to the river. I think it's the Ob River in Russia. This is a picture from Siberia. So what you see here actually looks not that different from our salt marsh, but just on a much bigger scale. And so we thought, oh, that's cool. Basically what you have is a sort of a system that has, on the one hand, streams that it drains there, so you have to remove the water. But you also have a sort of a very quick and sharp transition to a peatland phase, which actually does the opposite. It sort of blocks the water flow. And so it looks like you go from one state to another state in this landscape. Now this is basically what Argontola is studying. So we are using our salt marsh model and applied on a much bigger scale for that. And then we link that to a peatland model, which then shows the development of these peat stripes within this little part of the creek system. And so then we want to investigate how this works, particularly the transition from a peatland that's maintaining its water, wants to keep its water in, and then there's a sort of hydrodynamic switch to the green parts, where actually the vegetation allows these creeks to form, or let's put it like this: the creeks are forming, draining the landscape. But this is an ongoing project. So what I would do with that within the geopark? Well, what we're doing now is we're making 3D visualizations of that landscape. And so this is basically how we are reconstructing that landscape. It looks a bit mathematical. That's because it is mathematics. This is just, so what we do is we take these model outputs, we put them in a 3D visualization program, and we put the plants on top of them, and it looks like about what you see in these earlier depictions. And the geopark is quite happy with this, because they like to have these reconstructions of these early landscapes. And so they are co-funding the project of Argontola. So this is how I nowadays combine doing something useful with actually, because they are not, the geopark is not interested in precise predictions. They find it fine that it's a sort of a generalized understanding of how the peatlands works. I mean, there's no need for precise prediction. It's about the idea. So they are, for me, an ideal partner to study these historic landscapes. And so, yeah, this is another picture of how we are doing this. This is a project that's ongoing. One thing that we still want to add, if you make a landscape like this, this is the computer, then you can, of course, ask yourself, you have the most beautiful photographs. What do you need a 3D visualization for? Of course, that's a valid point. But we want to give the people the impression that they are seeing the Zeeland area in Roman times. So what we now have to do, we have to add all sorts of stuff that makes this look like a Roman landscape. And also how the humans were living in this landscape. They were making fields, they were plowing it, they were digging for peat. So we will include the human effects. I'm not doing it myself. We have people making that, and so we make it actually that it gives people the impression that they are looking to the past of their own landscape. Okay, so far any questions? I'm not finished yet, but within 10 minutes I think I'm finished. So I want to give you a little bit more of an idea how we do this. And for that, this is not a finished project. We will take another finished project, which deals with the historic salt marsh landscapes. And I show you this. Don't go too fast, come on. And so what you see here is a church, which is well, whatever. There's an area here which is an old village. Oh man, these are an automatic continuation. Well, I'll just push them back. So what you see here is a church. That's the center of an old village. The village itself went on in the northwestern, the right side, and so left the pristine village is still quite intact. What's interesting is that there is you see there's a lonely tree there, you know, about there. There. And the lonely tree is a remnant of a moat castle, 11th century moat castle. So it's a big mound which a tower has stood, which is the precursor of the castles that we all know, the Disneyland castle, so to say. Other interesting thing is that you see there a road. Underneath the road, there's a river, a creek bedding. So the road is actually a creek. So what we actually are planning to do is we want to reconstruct a landscape that existed in 1150 with the idea to show people how they were living on the salt marsh at that stage. And why would we want to do that? Because at that stage, there were hardly any dikes. It was just open. Nowadays, we live behind big dikes, and the land within the dikes is sinking, and the outside of the dike, the water is rising. Of course, if we wouldn't have had the dikes, the land would just have followed sea level rise. It would actually be much better. So, well, in a way, but it's a bit simplistic, of course. But it's to show that actually having natural landscape follow the sea level is beneficial. So we are basically reconstructing the landscape, as you can see here. So we make models of the landscape. We combine it with historic information about the mounds. For instance, this is, come on, this is the picture of a mound here, but there used to be a second one. You can see that here. That's gone. We can actually find the records of a person asking in the 19th century, can we remove that? And then answer, okay. So there was actually two mounds. And so I'm going to skip this. So basically, we then set up a pipeline of basically the self-organization models into, well, you combine it with other information, and we use some noise to otherwise it looks a bit sterile and very mathematical. And we assemble that into a reconstruction of the landscape. We then combine that with objects. We need plants. So where you get your plants from? Well, the same guy that made the very first visualizations, we can just buy plants from him. For 100 euros, he makes the plants. I can never compete with that. And so we just buy plants. Digital plants, of course. There was a bit of an issue because at some point the bill came, and the receptionist came to me. Here is a bill from a plant, but I'm quite sure that no plants were delivered at the reception. And I had to explain to them that they were digital plants. So anyway, so then in Jupyter scripts we basically reconstruct the landscape, and we find ways to show what plants are where in the landscape. And then we use a program called Blender to visualize. In Blender you can yourself make all sorts of things, but that's not how we work. Yeah, so you can make, well, whatever. But Blender also allows coding in Python. So we code the whole build-up of the vegetation. So it's a completely coded system, which basically you can run press the run button, and then within 2, 3, 4 minutes, the whole landscape is constructed within this 3D visualization, and you can ask it to make a picture. For that, of course, you need things like houses, as you can see, and you can need the castles, as you can see here. A few I made myself, just for trying. I want to know what it's all about, but then I think, okay, done it. Have somebody bake it. Viking ships. This is the time that there were Viking ships. They were used everywhere, not only in Denmark. And so you just buy them online. I think this set was in total about 100 euros. So I can never compete with that. And you need people, as you can see here. And then you make the landscape, as you see here. And this is, you're on the road. If you would understand where this ship is, you would stand on the road. The reason is that the whole landscape surrounding it was probably occupied by little fields. And of course, the creek was slowly silting up. At some point, it was just a little bit of whatever. And they made it a road because it was free, it was open, everybody could use it. And so, this is the landscape, so the two towers, as you can see here. It's not Lord of the Rings, but these were basically the local knight landlords had these castles, at first for function, later for prestige. We actually don't know too much about them, but these are basically built based on German reconstructions. And what is an important message is, look at the dike. You see the dike? The dike is there. This is the dike. It was 1.5 meters high. That was enough. This high protected you against the sea. That's because it was already very high, this landscape. It was followed sea level rise. And then the landscape itself buffered away all the waves. The waves are actually the biggest problem. The waves will have destroyed the dike long before it actually goes over the top. It will never go over the top. The dike will just breach and will go through. That doesn't happen here because the salt marsh is buffering away all the wave action. And then you have to also sort of get a perspective of the differences in the dangers in this time. To protect yourself against the sea, you made a 1.5 meter dike, as you can see here. And to protect yourself against the lords of Ierseke, this is near Wemel, well, the lords of the next village, you would build a 10-meter mound. Nowadays, we make 10-meter dikes, and we don't bother about the lords of Ierseke anymore. So you see the change in perception of danger. Nowadays, we are very much focused on the sea as a big, and of course, and that's also because the land has sunk so deep. Here, it hadn't sunken yet, and keeping out the sea was not such a big problem. And they would grow crops on the marsh, and you would think like, huh, in the salt? Yeah, in the salt. And actually, people have studied that. They have cleared, in the north of the Netherlands, they have cleared salt marshes and put gerst, what's barley in, and it grew, was no problem, as long as it doesn't last too long. So what do we offer now to the municipality is we've made an app, so you can now go on this road, stand there on the spot, and you put your app. It's actually just a web page, so you look at it, and you can look around in the past. You can actually, I have a fancy thing, so if you like to do that, and you can, I've got fancy 3D glasses here. They're not the latest model from Meta, but just, so you can scan the code with your camera. It opens that website, and you can put this on your, I only got one, on your telephone, and you can look around in 3D. So if you like, you can try that. I've actually also started a company to support that, because it was, they said, oh, it's so fantastic, this landscape, but we have this sluice there, and we want to show the people how the sluice looked like in 1900. And then the problem was like, well, that doesn't really match the goals of the institute. So the institute says like, no, that's not our business. So I started a company, and with a couple of friends who were enthusiastic about that, and we made the visualization of the sluice also. That was also a last project, but I'm not going to get rich of this country, of that company. Most likely also the last project. But anyway, if you like, you can have a look at it, and you can also see it just on your telephone and look around. There's a few buttons, and then allows you to look around in the landscape of the past in the Netherlands. And with that, I would like to end my talk. Any questions? No questions. Good. Well, if you like, then here, where's my glasses? Okay.
Have you already had interaction with the people that saw this development, and what do they comment to you?
What development?
So, I mean, like the people that live near you, when they see this, what do they say?
Typical reaction is like, sometimes I hear like, somebody has made this, and then they say, yeah, that was me. You? Yeah, that was me. Oh, how do you do that then? And I said, part of my work in Isuke. Oh, and so it's basically just, they can't contemplate that's just their neighbor, so to say, or that's doing that. And typically they like it very much. One thing is what was quite striking is I made this system for somebody to go to the location and look around, but you can also just look at it on your own computer. And I've given people these glasses and I have go have a look. And then they come back the next time and say, oh, it was so fantastic. I was with my kids and we were at home and we went to the website and we put it on. And I said, did you also go to the location? No, we just stayed at home. But yeah, if they like that, then why not? I mean, that's also fine. But this sort of, sells, so I can, for other projects we also have, so also for ED embankments, we're going to do similar things. And we also want to catch up with the latest developments. It's with the current gaming technology, Unreal Engine, you can make this move and all these sorts of things. And so this I made myself, not the specific things, but the construction I made myself. I did that mostly, I learned to do that during COVID. COVID is gone. I would love to sort of see how you can do that in Unreal, but that's not realistic. I need a new global disease for that. And so now somebody else is hoping, at the NEOS, I hope that I can get the funding for him to pick that up. And then, it will. We're not really sure what for shape we will give that, or whether it will be a game. I'm not really sure that will actually work. But at least we can make movies, and we can, for instance, we can start with this overview visualization of the whole landscape, and then just move down, and then land in the village. Yeah, that would, I think, be quite a nice experience. And then we can make a movie and interviews and a manager, and then we have a few of these things. And that I think sells my research as being useful. I hope. At least it's fun. Yeah, that was the idea. Yeah. It's also, if you ask people that, imagine that you could stand here, you could take out your phone and you could look back in time. And they say, oh, that would be nice, that would be nice. And with the idea that you never do that. But it's actually possible. It's of course limited, but you're basically looking at a ball-shaped photograph. It's all static up to now. And you can look around in that way. And that's, yeah. Yes. Nigel?
So could you use AI so that you could make your whole thing do this anywhere in the world? You know,
so of course.
So that it knows your location, and then the AI does all the sort of things that you do, and then and then you could also. Yeah, you can imagine that could be quite cool. I mean, after all,
of course,
Pokemon became a really big thing. You know, I remember my kids. I was wandering around Walmart at like 3 a.m. trying to find some creature that was supposed to be there, and I mean.
Of course. On the one hand, I thought like, no, there's nothing. Everybody can make this, and nothing special for me anymore. And so, of course, I went behind DALL-E and I typed in, give me a scene of a medieval house, I got a house. I thought, this is a house from the 16th century. So I have the 11th century, got the same house. And then I said, like, with a straw, there was a tile roof, with a straw roof, I still got the tile roof. And so it has just a few pictures, and it builds from these few pictures. And if you ask it to find an 11th century house, which actually there's not that much pictures available of that, it just gives you nonsense.
Yeah, but I mean, it'd be very cool as a way to broaden people's awareness of where they are. Like, you're doing this in America, and you sort of put on the goggles, so you're seeing augmented reality, and then you sort of see that there's sort of
Yeah.
indigenous species, you know, the first people who are there, not just the people you can see in front of you and things like that. It could
I
be a
think it
very
would be
nice
possible if you-
window into the past.
Particularly if you sort of train it yourself, you make sure that for the area you actually have the training available. And it would be interesting whether it can do the integration. If you just give it a rough picture of a house, and you say, put the house there, and in the scenery with a person in front of it, that it actually could construct that. I think that would be possible.
I think if you made a company and said we're going to build a time machine using AI, I think you'd be able to get millions of dollars from some investors.
Yeah. What I also noticed in my company is that scientists are harder workers than commercially oriented people with sharp suits on. And I did most of the work. And so I'm not so sure whether I will continue with that. Yeah, and they are always saying how hard they work. They don't work hard at all. Nothing like a scientist. So.
Any other question? No more questions?
Okay.
All right. So then I think we can thank Johan again for not only this, but all the great lectures over the week.
Thank you.